grand clock tower of Winterbourne Palace had just struck 2 in the morning, the heavy bronze chimes vibrating through the frozen air when Queen Eleanor descended the grand staircase for the last time. Behind her, a single royal guardsman carried a modest leather trunk. She wore a heavy midnight blue travelling cloak over a simple morning dress, her long dark hair, loose and pinned cascading over her shoulders like shadows. She had not summoned her ladies-in-waiting to arrange it. She had not summoned anyone. The silver sconces lining the vast vaulted walls threw her elongated shadow across the frost-veined marble floor. The palace around her was entombed in absolute silence. It was the crushing stillness of an empire that did not yet realize its heart was being carved out. She had packed her belongings in less than an hour. She had taken no jewels, no royal finery, and no gold. Upstairs, resting upon a crimson velvet cushion on her vanity, was the winter crown, a magnificent, suffocating circle of platinum and diamonds. She had taken it off, placed it down, and walked away. Her movements were driven by a terrifying, absolute calm. It was not the composure of a diplomat, but the chilling serenity of a woman who had already died a silent death and was simply commanding her body to leave the tomb. The crisp, isolated strikes of her riding boots echoed upward into the darkness. She heard him before she saw him, his heavy footfalls stepping out from the shadows of the king's corridor, but she did not slow her pace. "Where do you think you are going?" Alaric asked. Eleanor reached the bottom of the grand staircase and moved across the cavernous great hall toward the heavy oak doors of the courtyard. Away from a man who looked his queen in the eye and told her he never loved her. "Eleanor, I did not mean—" "You meant it." She stopped then. Her pale hand rested against the iron-wrought handle of the massive door, and she turned to look back at him. King Alaric of House Valeris, 32 years old, standing on the marble steps of his own ancestral stronghold. He wore only a loose linen shirt and dark trousers, his face pale in the moonlight streaming through the high-arched windows. The expression on his face was one she had never witnessed in their 7 years of marriage. It was not royal fury. It was not the arrogant indignation of a monarch. It was the devastating realization of a man who had spoken a profound truth and was only just now feeling the edge of the blade he had swung. "I watched your eyes when you said it," Eleanor said, her voice echoing softly but sharply in the vast space. "There was no hesitation. You did not speak in anger. You chose those words with the full calculated knowledge of what they meant. And now, my king, I'm asking you to rule in the ruin of them." "Eleanor, you cannot simply leave. You are the queen." "You said you never loved me." She repeated his words back to him without a single tremor in her throat. She spoke them with the clinical precision of a judge reading a final sentence. "Never. That word is absolute, Alaric. It consumes, tonight. It consumes the rebellion of the Northern Lords last year. It consumes the dawn our daughter, Genevieve, was born. And it consumes the day I knelt before the high priest and bound my blood to yours. Every year of it, every morning of it, you chose the word never." She pushed the iron handle. The heavy oak door swung open, groaning against its hinges, and the brutal biting wind of the winter kingdom rushed into the great hall, swirling the hem of her heavy cloak. Outside, a solitary unmarked carriage waited on the cobblestones. She had sent a trusted stable boy to prepare it an hour ago, because she had known the very second the words left his mouth that she would not see the sun rise over Winterbourne Palace again. "Do not send your guards after me," she said, pulling her hood up. "Genevieve remains under the protection of Lady Clara. She will not be dragged from her bed at 2 in the morning simply because her father discovered he does not love her mother. You may explain my absence to the court tomorrow in whatever manner protects your pride." "I didn't say I do not value you." Alaric started taking a desperate step down the marble stairs. "You said you never loved me." Eleanor repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow cut through the howling wind. "And that is a decree I cannot unhear. May the gods bless your reign, Alaric." She stepped out into the snow. The heavy palace doors slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating like a cannon shot through the hollow halls. Alaric stood frozen, listening, as the carriage wheels ground against the frost-covered cobblestones, the sound fading into the howling winter winds, until there was nothing left but the oppressive, suffocating silence of his own castle. Lord Chancellor Stirling found the king still standing in the freezing draught of the Great Hall at 4 in the morning. The elderly statesman had dressed hastily, carrying a flickering silver candelabra. He did not speak immediately. He stood beside his monarch, looking through the glass panes of the doors at the dark, empty courtyard, where the carriage tracks were already being buried by the falling snow. "Your Majesty," Stirling said softly. "She left," Alaric said, his voice entirely hollow. "Yes, Your Majesty." Alaric did not blink. "I told her I never loved her." Stirling, a man who had navigated decades of political warfare and survived 3 monarchs, remained perfectly still. The candlelight flickered across his weathered face. "Did you mean it, sire?" Alaric answered without looking away from the snow. "Yes." The Lord Chancellor let out a long, slow breath. He looked out at the courtyard for another moment before turning back to the king. "Then I believe Your Majesty does not understand the language you speak," Stirling said quietly. "Because I have served the valorous crown for 40 years. And the man I watched sit beside the Queen in the council chambers every morning was a man who loved his wife." Stirling set the heavy candelabra on a marble side table, bowed his head respectfully, and retreated into the shadows of the palace, leaving the King of the Winter Realm standing alone in the cold, watching the tracks of his queen disappear into the night. The fracture had begun, as tragedies often do, over a matter of seemingly trivial consequence. It was late November, the height of the kingdom's tax season. There had been a grand banquet scheduled to honor the visiting lords of the Eastern Marches. Alaric had commanded it cancelled with merely 3 hours' notice, citing urgent military dispatches from the border that required his undivided attention. He had left Eleanor to face the sudden diplomatic fallout alone. She had managed it as she managed the entire kingdom's social architecture. She had personally drafted elegant letters to the insulted lords, sent casts of the finest royal vintage to their chambers, and smoothed over the geopolitical tension with a grace that belonged entirely to her. She had not scolded him that evening. She had not complained the following morning. She had spent 7 years smoothing the jagged edges of his reign without ever demanding a parade for her efforts. And then on a Tuesday night, Alaric returned to the royal study near midnight. He found Eleanor still sitting at the massive mahogany desk, the light of a single oil lamp catching the exhausted shadows beneath her eyes. She was meticulously reviewing the kingdom's winter grain allocations, a tedious monumental task he had asked her to oversee. As he walked in, removing his heavy riding gloves, he said, without even looking at her, "You can leave the ledgers for the scribes tomorrow. It is late." Something in the room shifted. The air grew suddenly terribly heavy. Eleanor went entirely still. She placed her quill down on the parchment, the ink bleeding into a tiny black star. "Alaric," she said softly. He paused near the fireplace, finally looking at her. "Do you love me?" She had never asked him that question. Not once in 7 years. Not on the night of their royal wedding, when she had stood trembling in her heavy, embroidered gown. Not on the bloody, terrifying dawn, when she had labored for 2 days to bring Princess Genevieve into the world, and he had stood by the tall, arched windows, staring out at the kingdom while she bled. She had never asked because the Dowager Queen Vivian, her mother, had taught her at 16 that a monarch's affection was a strategic vulnerability. Do not beg for what should be given freely, her mother had said. Eleanor had built her entire marriage, her entire reign, on the quiet belief that unyielding devotion and absolute loyalty would eventually blossom into love. Alaric stood by the roaring fire. He looked at her, considering the question with the same cold, analytical seriousness he applied to border treaties and war councils. She watched his face. She watched him weigh the variables, search his own heavily guarded heart. And she saw the exact second he arrived at his conclusion. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I do not believe I do. Not in the way the word is meant." Eleanor did not flinch. Her hands remained perfectly still on the edge of the mahogany desk. "And what way is the word meant, Alaric?" "What my parents shared." He said, his eyes darkening with old ghosts. That was love. It was a chaotic, burning thing. It consumed them both. My mother died of it, and my father lost his mind to it. He stopped, looking down at his hands. "What I feel for you is something else. It is profound admiration. It is the deepest regard. I rely on you completely to hold this kingdom together. But I have never. He stopped again, the silence stretching tight. I never loved you. I should not have let you believe otherwise. And there it was, the word never. She had heard it strike the stone floor of the study like a severed head. She sat there in the dim light, feeling the devastation ripple backward through time. It poisoned their 7 years together. It poisoned the morning in the grand cathedral when he had taken her hand to steady her nerves before the high priest. It poisoned the night Genevieve was born when he had stayed in the room simply because she had desperately asked him not to leave. All of it, every quiet moment of solace retroactively annihilated. She had stood up smooth the skirts of her gown, walked up the grand staircase, and packed her trunk in less than an hour. What she had built in 7 years at Winterbourne Palace was the foundation of an empire. She wrote over 400 diplomatic decrees a year because Alaric found political maneuvering tedious. She managed the royal treasuries. She personally ensured that the poorest provinces received their winter coal. She had planted the royal glasshouse. The week Genevieve was born because she needed to see something beautiful grow in a castle made of stone and ice. On their wedding night, Eleanor had been terrified. She had sat on the edge of the enormous canopy bed, the heavy crown slipping from her dark hair, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't unclasp her necklace. Alaric had sat beside her, taken her trembling hands, placed them flat against his chest over his own racing heart, and held them there. "My heart is frantic too," he had whispered. And she had laughed, a startled, genuine laugh that broke the terror. She had cherished that memory like a hidden jewel for 7 years. But as the carriage carried her further into the frozen night, she realized that memory belonged only to him now. He would have to live with it. He would have to turn it over in his hands every single night in his empty palace like a stolen artifact he could no longer afford to keep. He began to walk the palace in the days that followed. He did not walk with the purposeful stride of a monarch inspecting his domain. He walked like a ghost haunting his own halls. For 7 years, King Alaric had known every corridor, every tapestry, every echoing chamber of Winterbourne Palace. He had conquered armies and negotiated treaties that reshaped the map of the world from the head of the Great Council table. Yet he had never truly looked at the castle he ruled. Now the silence of the massive stone fortress was deafening. It was not merely the absence of noise. It was the absence of life. He noticed it first in the royal council chambers. When the heavy oak doors swung open and the lords of the realm took their seats, the velvet cushioned chair to Alaric's right remained empty. For 7 years, Eleanor had sat there. She had never spoken out of turn, but she had commanded the room with the subtle, terrifying grace of a true queen. When a lord grew too arrogant, she would simply shift the heavy silk of her skirts, a distinct rushing sound against the cold floor, and the room would fall silent. When a negotiation stalled, she would softly tap her diamond-encrusted rings against the mahogany table, signaling a shift in strategy. Now there were no rustling silks. There was no gentle tapping of rings. The lords bickered over tax grain and border patrols, their voices grating and loud echoing off the high stone vaults. Alaric sat on his frozen throne, the winter crown heavy upon his brow, and felt a profound suffocating exhaustion. He tried to read the diplomatic missives piled before him. There were over 40 scrolls awaiting his royal seal. He broke the wax on the first 3 and realized with a sickening jolt that he had never actually read beyond the first paragraph of any treaty in his entire reign. Eleanor had read them all. She had summarized them, negotiated the hidden clauses, and merely presented him with the parchment to sign. He retreated to the royal study. The grand room felt hollow. There were 3 tall crystal vases lined up perfectly along the massive windowsill, filled with dried winter flora. He had never noticed them before. He did not know who placed them there, though he knew it must have been her. He opened the ledger drawer of the mahogany desk. There, written in Eleanor's elegant sweeping script, were the winter provision schedules for the lower provinces already perfectly calculated and allocated for the next 3 months. She had been planning for a future she knew she might not be part of. She was always planning for the kingdom's survival. He stood in the center of the silent room, the cold draft from the window, chilling his face. The crushing realization settled upon his shoulders. Heavier than his royal mantle, he had not simply lost a wife in a moment of arrogant honesty. The kingdom had lost its architect, and the palace was already beginning to collapse. 7 days after her departure, Alaric could no longer stand the silence. He summoned his finest destrier, dismissed his royal guard, and rode out alone into the biting winter winds toward Rosemont Castle, the ancestral fortress of Eleanor's family, located deep within the frozen pine forests of the eastern valleys. He did not send a raven ahead. He did not draft a royal decree. He had foolishly believed that if he arrived in person, cloaked in his authority as king, something could be salvaged. He was wrong. The heavy iron gates of Rosemont were barred. Standing on the snow-covered battlements above them was not Eleanor, but the Dowager Queen Vivienne. Vivienne was 73 years old, wrapped tightly in black marten fur, her silver hair pulled back into a severe crown of braids. She had spent over 40 years managing a kingdom alongside Eleanor's father, navigating assassinations, wars, and famines, with the ruthless efficiency her daughter had brought to Winterbourne. She looked down at the king of the Winter Realm with the absolute freezing contempt of a woman who has already weighed a man's soul and found it violently lacking. "The gates remain closed, Your Majesty!" Vivienne's voice cracked like a whip over the howling wind, carrying perfectly to the ground below. Alaric pulled his dark cloak tighter against the cold. "I demand entry, Vivienne. I am the king and I wish to see my wife. 10 minutes of her time, that is all I ask." "You do not possess the authority to demand 10 seconds of her time on my lands," Vivienne replied, her voice steady and lethal. She stepped closer to the stone parapet, staring down at him. "My daughter arrived at these gates at dawn. She was riding in a frozen carriage, shivering in a thin traveling cloak over a mourning dress. She brought one trunk, Your Majesty. After 7 years of ruling your court, she left with one trunk. Her hair was tangled and loose because she did not even have the time to pin it before she fled your presence." Alaric gripped the leather reins of his horse, his jaw clenching. "I did not force her out." "You did worse," Vivienne sneered. "I took her in from the cold. I gave her hot wine in my own bed, and I held her trembling body until the exhaustion finally claimed her. Do you know what she said to me before she slept, Alaric? Nothing. She did not weep. She did not scream. She just stared at the fire as if the world had ended." The Dowager Queen paused, the winter wind whipping her black furs around her regal frame. "I taught her that Vivienne said, her voice dropping into something dangerous and soft. "I taught her that a queen does not beg. I taught her that requiring affection in a royal court was a vulnerability that would only lead to ruin. I spent 3 decades wondering if that was cruel advice. But she followed it. She asked you for nothing for 7 years. And on the one night, she asked you a single question. You struck her down with your arrogance." "Vivienne, please. You are not a cruel tyrant, Alaric. I've always known that—" Vivienne interrupted, her eyes cold as polished obsidian. "But fools are often more dangerous than tyrants, and fools do not deserve my daughter. Whatever you said to her, to break her, you must say the exact opposite to fix it. Whether a man of your profound blindness is capable of that is not my concern. Ride back to your empty castle, king." She turned her back on him and vanished from the battlements. The iron gates did not open. Alaric sat on his war horse in the freezing snow for a long time before he finally turned back toward the capital. He had conquered the Western Territories. He had crushed rebellions, but he had never felt as utterly defeated as he did riding away from Rosemont. 3 days later, Lady Clara, the head governess, requested a private audience in the king's study. Clara was a quiet, observant woman of noble birth, who had served the royal family since Princess Genevieve was an infant. She entered the room carrying a large velvet portfolio, her expression tight with an anxiety she was desperately trying to mask beneath royal protocol. She curtsied deeply, her dark woolen skirt sweeping the stone floor. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly, "but Her Royal Highness Princess Genevieve has been drawing. She has been very busy this past week." Alaric looked up from the unread treatise, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Leave them on the table, Clara. I will praise her work when I visit the nursery this evening." "Your Majesty!" Clara did not move. She clutched the velvet portfolio to her chest. I believe you need to look at them now, please. Alaric frowned. He set his quill down and gestured for her to approach. Clara laid the portfolio on the mahogany desk and opened it with shaking hands. There were 14 drawings. Genevieve was only 5 years old, her art bold and wildly unrefined, utilizing whatever expensive colored inks she could pilfer from the royal scribes. The figures were large, with exaggerated features and emphatic, almost violent strokes of color. Alaric pulled the heavy parchment sheets toward him, examining them one by one. In 9 of the drawings, the figures were clearly identifiable. There was a tall man always drawn in royal blue, Alaric. Beside him was a woman with dark hair, rendered in the specific shade of emerald green that Genevieve always associated with her mother's velvet riding gowns. In every single one of those 9 drawings, the king in blue was smiling, a grand sweeping curve of a mouth. He was smiling at the queen, at the princess, at the dogs. Then Alaric reached the remaining 5 drawings. In these, the green figure of the queen was missing. It was only the king in blue standing alone in massive empty rooms. Alaric's breath caught in his throat. In the drawings where Eleanor was absent, the king had no mouth. Genevieve had drawn his eyes, his crown, his blue royal robes. But the face was blank beneath the nose. A silent, faceless monarch. A man incapable of speaking, incapable of smiling, stripped of his voice and his joy. Lady Clara stood quietly beside the desk, watching the king's hands begin to tremble as he held the parchment. "She draws you smiling, sire," the governess whispered carefully. "Only in the portraits where Her Majesty the Queen is present. I noticed you have no expression. No voice in the others. I thought, as her father, you should see it." Alaric could not look away from the faceless, blue king. It was a brutal, innocent reflection of his own soul. He picked up one specific drawing from the pile of 9. It depicted 2 figures standing beside the royal frozen lake. It was a chaotic wash of silver and blue ink, and both the king and the queen possessed massive, joyous smiles. "Did I smile, Clara?" Alaric asked, his voice barely a rasp. "When we walked to the lake, I am just a servant, Your Majesty. It is not my place to—" "Answer me, Clara. You have watched us for years. Did I smile?" Clara looked at the drawing and then at the broken king. "You only ever smiled when Her Majesty was speaking, sire. We all knew it. Even the guards knew it. The palace was only ever warm when she was in the room." She curtsied again, her duty fulfilled, and quickly withdrew from the study, leaving the king alone. Alaric stared at the childish ink on the parchment. He touched the crudely drawn smile on the blue figure. His heart, buried under years of statecraft and armored in duty, finally shattered completely. He had not just driven away his wife. He had driven away the only part of himself that was human. The royal sickness descended upon Winterbourne Palace, not with the dramatic crash of an assassin's blade, but with the quiet, terrifying creep of a winter frost. It began on a bleak Monday morning. Princess Genevieve complained of a chill that the massive hearth fires could not banish. By Tuesday evening, the fever had taken her. Her small body burned beneath the heavy silk quilts, her skin flushed and damp, her breathing reduced to a shallow, ragged rasp that echoed horribly through the cavernous royal nursery. Lady Clara and the court physicians administered every remedy known to the kingdom, willow bark steeped in honey-cold compresses of rose water, burning sage to clear the humours, but the fever violently refused to break. At dawn on Wednesday, Lady Clara bypassed the king entirely and sent the fastest royal raven directly to Rosemont Castle. Queen Eleanor arrived at midday. She did not wait for the carriage doors to be opened by the guards. She practically threw herself from the moving cab, her dark riding habit dusted with snow, her face pale with a terror that stripped away every ounce of her usual regal composure. She tore through the great hall, her heavy skirts flying over the marble, ignoring the shocked bows of the courtiers and the frantic calls of the king's guard. King Alaric was already at the bedside when the heavy nursery doors burst open. He looked up, his face gaunt from 2 days without sleep, his royal tunic unbuttoned at the collar. They did not speak. The air in the room thick with the scent of camphor burning herbs, and desperate fear crystallized the moment their eyes met. The chasm between them was the notion of unspoken grief, but the dying child in the bed demanded a bridge, and so they built one out of necessity. They worked the sick room in suffocating proximity. They did not communicate directly. Instead, they passed commands and updates through Lady Clara, treating the terrified governess as a diplomatic envoy between two warring nations. Tell His Majesty to move the brazier away from the bed, the smoke is aggravating her lungs. Eleanor would command softly, her eyes fixed entirely on the cloth she was dipping into a silver basin of ice water. Inform the Queen that the physicians recommend willow bark every 2 hours, not 3. Alaric would reply, staring intently at the iron clock on the mantel. It was agonizing. It was a torture of the highest order. Yet, in its own tragic way, it was the most intimately natural they had been in weeks. They were a king and a queen stripped of their crowns, reduced to a mother and a father terrified of the dark. Their shared desperation was a gravity far stronger than the pride that had torn them apart. On the second night of her vigil near midnight, Eleanor stood to fetch fresh ice from the basin. She had not slept since the Raven arrived at Rosemont. 3 days of exhausting travel and unrelenting terror caught up to her in a single violent wave. Her knees buckled. The heavy crystal pitcher slipped from her hands, shattering against the stone floor. Alaric was moving before the glass even settled. He caught her by the waist just as she began to fall, his strong arm wrapping securely around her. He pulled her flush against his chest, bearing her weight entirely. For a fleeting, breathless second, she rested against him, her forehead dropping to his shoulder. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart beneath the silk of her bodice. He reached out with his free hand, dragging a thick fur blanket from the edge of the bed, and draped it carefully over her trembling shoulders. His fingers, rough from the sword hilt, but gentle, now brushed the nape of her neck. Eleanor closed her eyes. A shudder ran through her entire body. She stayed there, wrapped in his arms in the fur, for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened her eyes, placed a hand flat against his chest, and pushed herself upright. She did not meet his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice terribly brittle. She pulled the fur tightly around herself and walked back to the chair on her side of the bed. She did not remove the blanket. Alaric stood amidst the shattered glass, his hands suddenly empty and cold, aching with a phantom warmth he had no right to claim. The true nightmare arrived at 3 in the morning. The fever spiked to its terrifying zenith. Genevieve became violently delirious. She thrashed beneath the sheets, her tiny hands clawing at the air, calling out in fragmented, confused sobs. She cried for her mother, then for her father, then begged for the painted wooden horses she had left in the courtyard. Eleanor sat on the left side of the massive mattress, desperately smoothing the child's damp hair, her tears finally falling hot and fast. Alaric knelt on the right side, gripping his daughter's tiny burning hand in his massive scarred palms, silently begging the gods to take his life in exchange for hers. Suddenly Genevieve stopped thrashing, her breathing slowed to a painful wheeze. She opened her glassy, fever-bright eyes and stared directly across the bed at her father. "Papa." The 5-year-old princess roused, her voice piercing the heavy silence of the room. "Tell Mama you love her. Please, she is so sad. Tell her." What followed was a silence unlike any Alaric had ever known. It was not the empty silence of the great hall after Eleanor left. It was the crushing, pressurized silence of a man standing at the edge of a monstrous cliff, staring down at a leap he did not know how to make. Alaric's mouth opened. The word was there. He could feel it lodged in his throat like a burning coal. He wanted to say it. He wanted to scream it into the rafters of the palace so loudly that it would shatter the winter storms outside. But the king was a man bound by rigid, destructive definitions of truth. He was still the man who had stood in the royal study and given an honest answer based on a broken understanding of love. He could not say it now, not yet, because he knew that if he spoke it at this moment, it would be a desperate lie told to comfort a dying child, not a truth earned by a devoted husband. He would not taint the sacredness of the word by weaponizing it for comfort. He stared at his daughter's feverish face. His jaw worked, his chest heaved, but no sound came out. The great king of the Winter Realm, who had commanded armies with a single shout, was rendered completely pitifully mute. Eleanor watched his agonizing failure. A profound, devastating sorrow washed over her features, extinguishing whatever faint, flickering hope might have survived in her chest. She placed her hand gently over Genevieve's eyes, shielding the child from the sight of her father's paralysis. "Sleep, my sweet bird," Eleanor whispered, her voice rich with unshed tears and an ironclad resolve. "Everything will be as it should. Sleep now." Mercifully, the child's eyes closed. By the grace of the gods, the fever finally broke at dawn. The unnatural heat left Genevieve's skin, and her ragged breathing smoothed into the steady, peaceful rhythm of true sleep. The nightmare had passed, but the ruin it left behind was absolute. The grey, bruised light of the winter morning spilled through the tall windows. Eleanor stood her back, aching, her dress rumpled, and began to quietly gather her few belongings. She moved with the clinical detachment of a surgeon abandoning a battlefield. Alaric followed her out into the massive stone corridor. "She asked me to say it." Alaric set his voice raw, leaning against the cold wall. "Eleanor, I tried. I wanted to, but I could not say it falsely, not to her. I could not lie to my daughter to buy peace." Eleanor stopped. She turned slowly in the grey light of the hallway. Her face was exhausted, stripped of all royal artifice, leaving only the fierce, wounded woman beneath the crown. "I know you could not say it falsely, Alaric," she said, her voice eerily calm. "That is not what I'm holding against you. Do you think I wanted you to lie?" He looked at her, confused, the desperation bleeding into his eyes. "A word produced because a terrified child demanded it in a fever is not a word I can ever trust." Eleanor continued, her tone slicing through the air like a silver blade. "If you had spoken it last night, it would not have been your word. It would have been hers. You would have used our daughter's fear to excuse your own cowardice." She pulled her traveling cloak over her shoulders, fastening the heavy iron clasp at her throat. "I do not want your desperation, Alaric. I do not want your guilt. Come back to me when you have found your own reasons." She looked at him for one agonizing moment longer. Thank you for staying by her side. She needed her father. She turned and descended the grand staircase. He did not follow. He stood frozen in the cold corridor, listening to the heavy oak doors open and close, followed by the crunch of carriage wheels on the frosty gravel. He went back into the nursery, collapsed into the chair beside his sleeping daughter, and buried his face in his hands until the failure of the night before calcified into something he could carry. For days afterward, the king could not sleep. The royal chambers felt like a crypt. He began to walk the palace grounds at night, driven by a restless, punishing energy. He avoided the corridors they had walked together. He avoided the study. Eventually, his wandering led him out into the freezing courtyard toward the massive domed structure of glass and iron that sat at the edge of the royal gardens, the royal glass house. It was warm inside, the air thick with humidity and the rich, dark smell of damp earth. The winter garden was Eleanor's sanctuary. She had designed the irrigation systems, imported the soil, and curated the flora. It was a thriving jungle of life in the middle of a frozen wasteland. Alaric walked slowly down the central stone path, the ambient warmth a stark contrast to the ice in his veins. He looked at the lush green vines climbing the iron trellises, the vibrant winter roses blooming in the shadows. He realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that he had walked through this glass house 100 times over the years to summon her for state dinners or council meetings, but he had never once looked at what she was growing. He found the head botanist, an elderly man named Master Thorn, pruning a massive bush of silver-leaf nightshade in the back quadrant. "Her Majesty planted this section the week the princess was born," Thorn said quietly, not looking up from his shears, as if the king's presence at 3 a.m. was an entirely normal occurrence. "She told me she wanted something that could survive the harshest freeze, something that wouldn't die just because the sun went away." Alaric stared at the silver leaves. They were resilient, beautiful, and sharp, like her. "What else did she plant, Master Thorn?" Alaric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thorn pointed a gnarled finger across the glass house. He began to list them. The valerian root for the apothecaries, the weeping jasmine that bloomed only at dusk, the blue lotus imported from the southern deserts coaxed into life by Eleanor's relentless care, the climbing maiden's blush roses along the eastern glass. Alaric reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound diplomatic journal. He uncapped his charcoal stylus. "Tell me again," the king commanded softly. "Start from the beginning." He wrote down every single name. He wrote down the soil conditions. They required the watering schedules, the way they reacted to the light. He did not know what he intended to do with this botanical ledger. But as he stood in the humid, earthy dark, surrounded by the living, breathing testament of his wife's devotion, Alaric finally understood the magnitude of his crime. He had loved the beautiful, functioning garden she had built around him. He had bathed in its warmth and eaten of its fruits. but he had never not once bothered to learn the name of a single flower. It was during the deep, bitter freeze of midwinter that the first whisper of the poison reached the king's ears. A monarch is rarely the first to hear the gossip of his own court, insulated as he is by layers of sycophants and guards. But eventually a lie grows too large to hide in the shadows. It arrived in the form of Lord Harrington, a wealthy baron from the southern coastal regions, who had travelled to Winterbourne Palace to negotiate a trade tariff. They were seated in the king's solo, the heavy oak table between them, scattered with maps, when Harrington, with the careful, calculated casualness of a man probing for weakness, mentioned the unfortunate royal scandal. Alaric paused, his silver goblet halfway to his mouth. "Explain yourself, Lord Harrington." Harrington cleared his throat, leaning forward. "The circulating account, your majesty, the whispers sweeping through the eastern and southern courts, is that Her Majesty the Queen was dismissed from Winterbourne under the shadow of high treason, a discovery of marital infidelity, a betrayal of the royal bed. The temperature in the solar seemed to plummet 30 degrees in a single second. Alaric did not shout. He did not throw his goblet. He set it down with a click that sounded like a snapping bone in the quiet room. In a kingdom where the bloodline was everything, infidelity in a queen was not a mere scandal. It was high treason. It was a crime punishable by the headsman's block. And who is the architect of this lie? Alaric's voice was terrifyingly soft, a velvet scabbard sliding off a razor-sharp blade. "It is everywhere, sire." Harrington stammered, the colour draining from his face as he realised his fatal miscalculation. "It has been circulating for nearly a month. I only thought—" "You thought to test the waters," Alaric said, standing up. His massive frame shadowed the Baron. "You will ride out of my city within the hour. If I ever hear that word on your tongue again, I will have it removed from your mouth and fed to the hounds." He dismissed the trembling lord and immediately summoned his master of whispers. Within 3 hours, the spy master confirmed the horrifying truth that rumour had saturated 3 entire provinces. And worse, Queen Eleanor had been given a dozen opportunities by visiting nobles at Rosamond Castle to categorically deny it, to strike the rumour down with her own authority. Every single time the matter was raised in her presence, she had politely, firmly changed the subject. She had refused to confirm or deny. Alaric paced his dark study that night, the fire dying in the hearth. Why, Eleanor was a fiercely proud woman. Her honour was impeccable. Why would she allow the kingdom to drag her name through the mud? Why would she permit the lords of the realm to believe she was a traitor to the crown? He stopped by the tall window, looking out at the frozen courtyard. And then somewhere in the freezing dark, the devastating realization struck him. It hit him with the force of a warhammer to the chest, driving the breath from his lungs. To correct the rumour, Eleanor would have to tell the truth. To clear her own name, she would be forced to stand before the lords and ladies of the court and speak his words aloud. She would have to look them in the eye and say, "The king told me he never loved me, and so I left." She would have to put his cruel, humiliating sentence into the mouths of every noble in the kingdom. She would have to expose the pathetic, broken reality of their monarch to the entire world. She was enduring a social execution. She was allowing a lie that touched her royal honour in the most severe way possible, simply to avoid speaking his painful words aloud again. Even in exile, even after he had broken her heart, she was still protecting him. She was absorbing the devastating cost of his arrogance, exactly as she had absorbed every other burden quietly and without demanding thanks for 7 years. Alaric did not sleep that night. He did not go to the glass house. He went to the mahogany desk, called for a fresh inkwell, and began to write. He did not delegate this task to his scribes. He wrote the royal decrees himself, his handwriting, sharp and forceful cutting, into the thick parchment. He drafted over 80 letters, sealing each one with the heavy red wax of the Valerius crest. He addressed them to every lord baron magistrate and high priest in the kingdom. He named himself as the sole architect of the royal separation. He stated plainly, under the absolute authority of the Winter Crown, that Queen Eleanor's character, honour, and loyalty were flawless and entirely above reproach. He confessed to grievous personal failings that had driven his queen away, and he decreed that any man or woman caught speaking ill of her would be answering directly to the edge of the king's sword. He sealed the last letter as the sun rose, his fingers stained black with ink. He did not send a copy to Eleanor. He did not do this to win her back. He did it because he was finally learning how to be a husband, even if he was no longer allowed to be hers. 2 weeks later, the dead of winter momentarily broke, giving way to a crisp, blindingly bright afternoon. Eleanor returned to Winterbourne Palace for the first time since Genevieve's fever. She had sent a brief, brutally practical missive ahead of time, a letter stripped of all royal pleasantries dictating the exact hour of her arrival, to collect the princess for a fortnight visit to Rosemont. She did not ask for an audience with the king, she did not expect one. While the royal guards loaded Genevieve's trunks into the carriage, Eleanor walked the stone path bordering the Black Lake. The vast body of water was frozen solid, gleaming like a polished silver mirror under the pale afternoon sun. The ancient willow trees at the far end were bare, their skeletal branches draped in frost. She had loved this path since her first year at the palace. She walked it slowly, the heavy hem of her emerald green velvet cloak sweeping over the snow. She was making a final circuit in her mind, uncertain if she would ever walk these grounds again. Alaric found her standing at the wrought iron gate near the water's edge. He did not approach as a king demanding submission. He did not wear his crown. He wore a simple dark riding coat, and he stopped 10 paces away, giving her the space of an adversary who had earned her wariness. He did not attempt to explain himself. He did not begin with a groveling apology or a complicated political justification. He looked at her tall, unbroken posture against the frozen lake, and he spoke the simplest truth he had. "I have been sleeping in the royal glass house," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the crisp air. Eleanor turned her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. She did not speak. "The royal bedchamber is wrong." Alaric continued, taking a slow step forward. "The council room is wrong. The study is wrong. The only part of this massive fortress that still feels like it possesses a soul is the glass house. And that is because you built it. Your hands are in the soil. I can feel that you existed when I stand among the winter roses." He paused, his breath pluming in the cold air. "I have learned the names of every plant you cultivated. Master Thorn told me. I wrote them down in a ledger." Eleanor's expression remained perfectly guarded. "You are the king of the winter realm, Alaric. You should be memorizing troop movements, not the watering schedule of Blue Lotus. I have spent weeks thinking about the answer I gave you in the study," he said, ignoring her deflection, his voice growing thicker. "I told you I did not love you because I was measuring my heart against my parents' madness. Their love was a wildfire. It consumed them both. My mother died of the wanting, and my father died of the guilt. I watched them burn their kingdom to ash when I was 14 years old, and I decided right then that love was a disease that destroys empires." He stepped closer, closing the distance until he was only an arm's length away. He looked down at her, his icy blue eyes stripped of all royal armor, leaving only a desperate, profound clarity. "What I had with you was love, Eleanor," he said softly. "The quiet kind. The kind that builds cathedrals instead of burning them down. It was so steady, so perfectly reliable that I mistook it for the foundation of the palace itself. I mistook you for the architecture. For 7 years!" His voice finally broke, a raw, jagged sound. "When the architecture left, the castle collapsed." Eleanor looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face. Her expression did not immediately soften into forgiveness, but he saw something profound shift within her dark eyes. It was the careful, measured acknowledgement of a queen recognizing a genuine surrender. "That is the first completely honest thing you have said to me in 7 years," she said, her voice devoid of malice, yet possessing the absolute hardness of a diamond. "But honesty, Alaric, is not enough to rebuild a ruined throne." She turned slightly, her gloved hand gripping the frozen iron of the gate. "You lived beside me in the most intimate proximity possible for 7 years. You tell me the castle has fallen without me. You tell me you learned the names of my flowers. But you cannot sleep in a bed with a woman for 7 years and not know her soul. And I am entirely unconvinced that you know me at all." She let go of the gate and faced him fully. The challenge in her eyes was terrifying. "So prove it," she commanded softly. "Tell me 3 things about Eleanor. Not the queen who drafts your treaties, not the mother who raises your heir, not the quiet wife who managed your court and smoothed your political blunders. Tell me 3 things about me." Alaric breathed out, "I can do that." "Then do it." He searched his mind frantically, tearing through 7 years of memories trying to isolate the woman from the crown. You manage the royal treasuries with a precision that outmatches the High Coinmaster. That is the Queen. Eleanor interrupted, her voice exact, not unkind, just ruthlessly accurate. You are relentlessly patient with Genevieve when she refuses her tutors. That is a mother, she said. Alaric stopped. He stood on the frozen path, the afternoon light gleaming off the snow, and he looked at the woman he had married. He looked at her sharp jawline, her dark piercing eyes, the way she held her shoulders. He searched the vast archives of his mind, and to his absolute horror, he could not find her. He could find the ruler. He could find the mother. He could find the diplomat. He could not find Eleanor the woman standing separate and entire on her own ground. Eleanor watched him fail. She watched the realization drain the color from his face. She did not mock him. The profound sadness that passed over her features was far worse than anger. You do not know me, Alaric. She whispered, the wind carrying the words away as soon as they left her lips. You loved what I provided for you, not who I am. You loved the architecture, but you never once bothered to ask what the architecture dreamed of. She stepped past him on the path, the heavy velvet of her cloak brushing against his frozen boots. Come back when you can answer the question, she said, not looking back. 3 things about me. I will be at Rosemont. Yeah. She walked away, leaving the king of the winter realm, standing alone by the frozen lake, clutching a question he was terrified he might never be able to answer. He did not immediately return to Rosemont. King Alaric understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that a siege of the heart could not be won with brute force or hasty maneuvers. It required patience. It required the painful, agonizing work of dismantling his own assumptions. He spent the next 5 weeks walking the echoing halls of Winterbourne Palace, dissecting his 7 years of marriage, not as a monarch reviewing a treaty, but as a starving man desperate for a single drop of water. He sat in the royal study in the dead of night, staring at her empty chair. He thought about what he actually knew, separating the queen he relied upon from the woman she truly was. His first attempt to answer her challenge was a failure of observation. He rode to Rosemont 9 days after their confrontation by the lake. Eleanor received him in the minor drawing room, standing by the hearth, her posture perfectly rigid. You hum when you arrange the winter roses, Alaric said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Eleanor looked at him with the terrifying, infinite patience of a woman who was already prepared for disappointment. I hum when I am anxious, Alaric, she said smoothly. Arranging the winter blooms makes me anxious because the thorns are sharp. I am not a natural botanist, and I want the royal arrangements to look flawless for the court. That is a reaction to a duty. It is not a truth about my soul. Try again. He rode back to his frozen capital. He spent another 12 days locked in the palace, turning over every memory, every fleeting glance, every quiet morning. He returned to Rosemont. You read the diplomatic ledgers sitting on the velvet window seat in the eastern solar, he said, standing in the courtyard, because the morning light strikes the glass perfectly there. Eleanor sighed, the frozen air pluming around her face. Everyone reads where the light is best, Alaric. That is not profound knowledge. That is merely observation with absolutely no understanding behind it. Come back to me with something that is actually mine. He turned to leave his chest tight with the devastating realization that he might truly be incapable of knowing her. He walked down the snow-covered path toward his horse, his hand reaching for the iron gate latch when she called his name. He turned. Eleanor crossed the frozen path in 3 quick strides. She reached up, took his face in both of her gloved hands, and kissed him. It was not a desperate, sweeping embrace. It was firm, brief, and entirely deliberate. She stepped back, her dark eyes locking onto his shocked expression. That was not forgiveness, she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze ironclad. Do not mistake it for a pardon. It is simply proof that I desperately want you to succeed. It is proof that I am not hoping you fail. Come back with better answers, my king. She walked back inside. Her hands were still burning against his jaw, all the long freezing ride back to Winterbourne, 5 weeks after the confrontation by the Black Lake. On a bitterly cold Thursday afternoon in late December, Alaric stood before the heavy oak doors of Rosemont Castle and knocked. Eleanor opened it herself. She wore a simple, unadorned grey wool gown. She looked at him, her hand resting on the heavy iron doorframe, and he could see the tragic guarded look in her eyes. She had meticulously trained herself not to hope, because expecting him to understand had already cost her too much blood. Alaric did not offer a royal greeting. He did not bow. He stood in the falling snow and spoke. You read the final penalty clause of every treaty. First, he said, his voice cutting through the winter wind steady and absolute. I noticed it in our second year of marriage. You would take the parchment, ignore the grand titles, and the peaceful proclamations, and flip immediately to the wax seal to read the consequences of a breach. I thought it was just the cautious habit of a wartime queen. Eleanor's hand tightened imperceptibly on the doorframe. But you told me once, Alaric continued, taking a slow step closer. We were in the royal archives. I was still wearing my chainmail from the northern border skirmish. You told me it was because your father, the late king, lost the entire eastern province because he trusted the preamble of a treaty and failed to read the hidden clause at the bottom. He died of a broken heart because of it. You swore on his grave you would never be blind to how a pact ends. You have read the last page of every document first ever since. Eleanor did not move. The wind howled around the stone turrets above them. You are utterly terrified of the sea, Alaric said, his voice dropping, carrying the weight of a sacred confession. You have been afraid of the dark water since before I ever put a crown on your head. I do not know what happened. You never told me, and I was too arrogant, too blind to ever ask. And that is a failure I will carry to my grave. But you board the royal flagship every single summer. He looked directly into her eyes, breaking through the queen's armor, speaking directly to the woman. Every summer, without fail, you walk up the gangplank. You stand on the deck as the fleet sails for the summer isles. And I know why. Because Genevieve told me when she was 4 years old. She said, Mama holds my hand on the boat because she loves the water. But you don't. You grip the wooden rails until your knuckles are white. You endure absolute terror for weeks at a time because your daughter loves the ocean, and you decided her joy was worth more than your fear. You ride out into the dark water terrified, and you have never let our daughter see it once. He paused. The silence between them was profound, heavier than any crown, deeper than any ocean. And you hum, Alaric whispered. He stepped up into the doorway, out of the snow entering her space. I told you before that you hum when you arrange the winter roses, and you told me I was wrong. And you were right. I went back to an empty palace, and I thought about when I'd actually heard that melody, when I'd truly been in the room with you. It is not when you are anxious. It is when Genevieve is finally asleep, when the royal court has retired, when the castle is dead quiet, and you think absolutely no one in the world can hear you. Eleanor's breath hitched. A single tear broke free, tracking hot and fast down her pale cheek. You are always doing something small, Alaric said, his voice breaking, folding a ribbon or standing by the high window, looking out at the snow. You hum the exact same ancient melody every time. I do not know its name. I've never known its name, but I've heard it echoing in my head every single night for the past 9 weeks. Every night since you abandoned the throne, and I only just now understood what it was. He reached out his bare hand, gently brushing the tear from her cheek. It was the sound of you being happy. What followed was a stillness unlike any that had ever existed in the Valerius dynasty. It was not the suffocating silence of an empty throne room, nor the breathless tension of a battlefield. It was the devastating, beautiful stillness of something precious, buried beneath years of ice and duty finally breaking the surface to breathe. Eleanor stood in the doorway of Rosamond Castle, and she did not speak for a long, agonizing moment. Alaric waited. He waited because he had learned in the freezing dark of the royal glass house, and the crushing loneliness of his own bed, that waiting for her was an honor, not a chore. The melody is an old lullaby my mother sang. Eleanor whispered at last, her voice incredibly fragile, stripped of all its royal iron. She sang it when she was walking in the summer gardens, before the wars began. I did not know I hummed it aloud. I did not know anyone had ever heard it. Heard it, Eleanor? Alaric said, his eyes burning. I heard it for 7 years. I was just too great a fool to understand what I was hearing. But I do now. He met her gaze steadily, a king offering his absolute surrender. Now I do. She looked at him. She looked at the exhaustion etched into his features, the genuine raw truth bleeding from his posture. Then slowly, she stepped back from the doorframe. It was not a grand dramatic invitation. It was not a royal decree. It was simply the offering of space. A space he could choose to step into or walk away from. Alaric did not hesitate. He crossed the threshold. Eleanor closed the heavy oak door behind them, shutting out the winter storm, leaving them both on the same side of the fortress walls. And that was enough for today. He did not ask for a crown. He did not ask for a promise. He just stood with her in the warmth. Deep winter eventually loosened its death grip on the kingdom. Frost still clung to the high spires of Winterbourne Palace, but the mornings were brighter, the light fracturing through the stained glass of the great hall. Alaric was kneeling in the dirt of the royal glass house at dawn. He wore no royal finery, just a simple linen shirt, and dark trousers carefully pruning the massive silver-leaf nightshade bush. The heavy iron door of the glass house creaked open behind him. He heard the soft, deliberate rustle of heavy skirts. He had catalogued that specific sound over 9 agonizing weeks of absence, mapping it into his soul the way a sailor maps the stars. He did not turn around immediately. He kept his hands steady on the iron shears. "You are cutting entirely too close to the root," she said. Alaric smiled, a genuine quiet curve of his mouth that reached his eyes. "I have read 3 botanical treatises on the nightshade. My queen and I am apparently still butchering it. Give me the shears." He held them up over his shoulder. Eleanor stepped behind him. She crouched down, her heavy emerald cloak pooling around them on the damp earth. She didn't take the shears from him. Instead, her bare, warm hands covered his. She adjusted his grip, moving his thumb slightly higher on the iron handle, shifting the angle of the blade. "Cut at the node," she murmured, her cheek brushing against his shoulder. "Not below it. Right here." She guided his hands. The silver leaf came away cleanly. "Better," she said softly. Alaric stood up, pulling her up with him. He turned to face her. She was wearing the winter crown. It sat perfectly amidst her dark, pinned hair, gleaming in the morning light. Through the glass walls behind her, he could see the royal guardsmen carrying her trunks back into the palace. "I am not the same woman who walked out of those doors. In the middle of the night." Eleanor set her dark eyes locking onto his, searching for any hesitation. "I know," Alaric said quietly. "And the words I said to you. They are poisoned into the stones of this castle. I know you hear them." "I hear them standing right here," she admitted, her voice steady. "I will hear them tomorrow in the council room. I will hear them next November, and on every day that the kingdom demands too much of us. You cannot pull those words out of the walls, Alaric." "I know, but..." Eleanor stepped closer, resting her hand flat against his chest right over his racing heart, just as he had done for her on their wedding night. "You can put better words into the stones. You can speak truer things every single day, if you possess the courage until the castle sounds different. I am asking you to do that." She paused, her thumb tracing the linen over his heart. "Start now." Alaric looked down at her. He looked at the frost clinging to the glass, the shears in his hand, and the incredible, terrifying weight of the crown upon her head. He did not search for the right words, because the right words had been burning a hole in his chest for months. "I love you," Alaric said. The king's voice did not waver. It echoed with the absolute authority of a man who had finally conquered himself. "I loved you when you planted this glass house in the freezing dark. I loved you when you smoothed my political arrogance in the Great Hall. I loved you every single day for 7 years. I called it duty. I called it reliance. I called it everything but the truth, because I was terrified of what love could destroy." He dropped the shears into the dirt and took her face in his hands. "What I built with you is not destruction, Eleanor. It is the only thing keeping me alive. I have the name for it now." "Say it again," she whispered, her eyes shining. "I love you, Eleanor." She was quiet for a heartbeat. Then she reached down, took his hand, and laced her fingers perfectly through his. Her grip was not gentle. It was the fierce, unyielding hold of a queen reclaiming her territory. "The iron hinges on the glasshouse door are screaming," Eleanor said, glancing toward the entrance. Alaric looked at the massive door. "There is absolutely nothing wrong with those hinges." "There is now," she said, pulling him slightly toward the exit. 9 weeks of nobody opening it properly. Iron seizes when it is left in the cold. We will need to see to it. They walked out of the glass house, together, her hand locked in his. The scent of winter roses clung to their clothes. The heavy iron door swung shut behind them, the hinges letting out a long metallic groan. It was not a broken sound. It was the distinct, beautiful noise of something that had been frozen for a very long time, finally beginning to move again.